Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our corporate sponsor, Google, for sponsoring this session, Transgender Perspectives in India. My name is Sandeep Nair, and I'm Program Associate at Community Business, and I will be your moderator for the session. As a thought leader and champion of diversity and inclusion, Community Business recognizes that many in our society are disadvantaged on the basis of their identity. Committed to promoting responsible and inclusive business practices, we believe that companies have a critical role to play in creating opportunities for disadvantaged or underrepresented groups to participate more fully in the society. The transgender community, who represent an estimated half a million in India, is one of the most misunderstood communities in India. This, despite the fact that throughout our history, transgender individuals have always been a visible part of our Indian culture and society. A variety of reasons, including a lack of understanding and a fear of their difference, has led transgender people to be discriminated, rejected, and pushed to the margins of the society. Our goal at Community Business is to increase understanding about the experiences of transgender individuals in India and encourage and give companies the confidence to take steps to promote transgender inclusion in their workplaces. So, in this session, we will hear the personal stories of discrimination and exclusion faced by two transgender individuals in India. We have also invited an expert to share her perspective on what can be done to promote greater transgender inclusion both by the government and the corporate sector in India. We would also like to highlight that today, Community Business is launching a brand new piece of research called Promoting Transgender Inclusion, the Role of Companies. So, we're going to start this session by listening to personal stories of two transgender individuals. Earlier this week, we had the privilege of interviewing Vinita Kumar and Viham Pitambar. We are honored to share their stories with you. First, we have Vinita Kumar. Vinita Kumar is a trans woman having transitioned from male to female surgically and is legally a woman. Vinita is well known in the LGBT community and is often seen as an inspiration to fellow LGBT members who are considering transition, exploring the transgender side, or even just looking for information on transgender life. Through the movie Project Indian Bride, Vinita portrays the many challenges and dreams of a trans woman in our society. The movie was screened at various international film festivals and has received widespread attention. Vinita, over to you.
Hi, my name is Vinita Kumar. I was born and raised in Kannur city in the state of Kerala, India. I currently work as a client service manager at Akamai Technologies. Since I transitioned from male to female, I do refer myself as a post-op trans woman. But I identify myself as a female. So what I really mean is I would refer myself as a transgender on a need-to basis, or to clarify this with someone new. Once I get that out of the way, I don't prefer to be addressed as a transgender because the whole reason I transitioned was because I'm a woman. I have completed my transition, including surgery, and my documents now read female as my gender. To talk a little bit about coming to terms with being transgender, I think I've always known I was a transgender at some level. I've always been different, going as far back as 2 years old. There were telltale signs of me being more feminine. People really picked it up on that, and my family, neighbors, everybody kind of knew. I think, even far back as probably 2 years old. However, it was a gradual learning process of figuring out, confirming, coming to terms with my gender identity, and finally deciding to transition. It was by no means easy and took a great deal out of me, and the whole process took over several years because it was sort of like me being gay at some point and trying to kind of fit in because my friends would tell me, no, you cannot transition, because it doesn't make sense. Why would you put yourself through so much of trauma in terms of physical? It's almost like mutilation. I mean, it kind of sounds wrong to put it, but then you are kind of having a surgery. And kind of going under the knife, it doesn't make sense. Why would you want to do it? And even to kind of integrate in the society, you tend to lose like more friends when you are transgender. People don't get it. You might not. I mean, if it affects your finances, because first of all, you have to put aside a lot of money for your surgery and for your recovery, and then it's what if you can't find a job? Then you're in a deeper problem. And it's a lot of stress on you, emotionally, mentally as well. So so that was there. And then even when I was sure that I think because of this, I kind of forgot that I wanted to transition. I am a female. I kind of tried to fit in as a gay man because it's much more easier. I mean, relatively easier than being a transgender. And obviously it didn't work. I was constantly, leaning towards being more feminine and trying to wear feminine clothes, female clothes, and trying to wear makeup and stuff like that. And which obviously, as when you're presenting yourself as a gay man and it's not really appreciated, and then you don't find somebody who wanna go out with your date you because you're presenting. I mean, you're kind of feminine, right? So that didn't work out so well, and eventually I went to a psychologist who kind of explained to me that I am a transgender, and rather I'm a female, and that's who I am. And it took me like a year and a half from that point to kind of decide that I want to transition, and another year or so to actually go ahead with the transition. So it took me several years from the time I actually reached out to a psychiatrist rather. I am yet to complete my FFS, or facial feminization surgeries, and facial hair removal. Although these are a very significant part of transition, I kept them for last for various reasons. I hope to complete them in a year's time. For me, coming out happened in several stages. I came out as a young gay man to my close friends and then colleagues, and after several years to my family, as I was trying to explain earlier. Then I came out again as a trans woman in a similar way. People reacted differently. Some shocked, some angry, some disgusted. I have lost friends and family and colleagues to me being a trans woman. But with those who stayed or liked me more for who I am, gave me the strength and will to move forward. They are my rock, truly. To my surprise, LGBT community was far more biased, ill-informed, and plain rude to me on my face and behind my back. Some thought that I've gone mad, or that I want to be a sex worker, or simply be more promiscuous in a manner that now that I'm a woman, men would like me more. That's just absurd. There were gay men who told me that they don't want to be seen with me. If I want to talk about my personal experiences in India, I would say inclusion and acceptance were the two main things I'm concerned about as a trans woman living in India. And this, I mean, both in personal, social, economic, and work life. In the beginning, I would avoid, going to any functions, parties, events, weddings, anywhere social to avoid being recognized as transgender, for fear of ridicule, being thrown out of the party or event, etc. Who wants to deal with that? I just wanted to have a low profile and just get by every day. I dreaded searching for a house when I wanted to live alone because living with family was dreadful. That they would lock me in my room, and when we had visitors and neighbors come to our house, I had to be invisible and hide the changes in me from my hormone replacement therapy and pass as a boy still. So I had to go out of my house as a boy, then change into female clothes and wear makeup at work or sometimes in the cab, etc. It was awful, to say the least. I think the worst is people staring at me and trying to unravel the mystery of who or what I am. If only people knew better. The fact that you cannot change birth certificate in India is also a big drawback. All these experiences had significant impact in the way I navigate all walks of my life and the people in them, be it new or existing ones. Loneliness, depression, and insecurity did strike me hard, but I am at a better place now with all the beautiful people in my life, and I believe it will only get better. My family is also now significantly more accepting and supportive than they ever were. In the end, though, I am a survivor, and survive I will, no matter what. To talk a little bit about my workplace experiences, it was hard in the beginning. When I came out as a trans woman, I became an instant celebrity of sorts, the talk of the campus. Everyone at the food court would stare at me, like turn their heads and keep staring at me. I stopped eating at the food court, and I would just go quickly, get a takeaway, and leave as quickly as I can. My colleagues, mostly men, no longer wanted me to be part of smoke breaks or dinner breaks. The ladies had no problems though, for the most part. I felt like I was being ignored and left out. This affected me greatly. I was irritated and couldn't perform well at work. I dreaded finding a job once I left the company that I was working for. I've had interviewers stare at me, and so I couldn't face it anymore. But of course, I couldn't let that stop me. I had to get a job, and with a lot of determination and being prepared to face the worst, I attended a couple of interviews that I carefully screened, and then landed a career at Akamai, which was a pleasant hiring experience. I would add that I wasn't even sure that the interview panel was aware that I am a trans woman, because nobody brought it up and no one stared at me or asked any uncomfortable or unnecessary questions around it. I did inform the HR when I applied for the job though, so I think the panel was probably sensitized on the subject. And even when I started working at Akamai, I didn't feel discriminated, and people didn't stare or slyly ridicule me, etc. I felt like I just fit right in, and there was nothing different about me, and that is a good feeling. I think the biggest thing that the companies can do is to promote an inclusive culture, a kinder, mature work environment. Diversity and inclusion should be in the DNA of every company. They can start by having inclusive names, words, nouns, and pronouns, etc., like they, partner, spouse, etc. Companies should also try and have awareness programs, training, signs, and posters around LGBT inclusion. Driving a strong ally support and network is also a very significant achievement towards successful LGBT initiatives at work. I wish every company would work to better their culture and get the support of the leadership at every level, and also engage employees at the bottom of the totem pole as well. It cannot be a policy or company's value that resides on paper or at the executive or HR level, but something that should live within the company in its day-to-day operations and interactions with its customers, employees, vendors, and everyone in general. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vinita, for sharing your personal experiences with us. I now like to introduce Bihan Pitambar. Bihan Pitambar is a trans activist and communication management professional based in Kerala. Bihan is a board member of the Ernakulam District Transgender Justice Board and the Queerella, a LGBT plus organization. Bihan gave up a thriving advertising career in Dubai to transition and live his truth. Through advocacy, Bihan hopes to inspire people, normalize trans identities, and bring trans citizens in India to the mainstream. Bihan, over to you.
Hi, my name is Vihan Pitambar. I used to work in Dubai as a communication management professional with an advertising firm, but I gave that up to complete my transition both medically and legally in Kerala. Owing to the struggles that I faced with the Gazette of Kerala to change my gender legally, I realized how crucial it was for people like me to speak up about my gender identity, to throw light on the existence of trans men who are an invisible minority within the transgender community. That's how I got involved in the advocacy space in Kerala. And currently, I am a board member of the Ernakulam District Transgender Justice Board and of Queerala, an LGBTIQA organization. I was female assigned at birth, and I've medically transitioned to a male. The term transgender in itself is quite complex. Most people don't know that transgender is just an umbrella term, and there are a lot of identities that fall under this. People like me, we fall under the binaries of being either male or female, and we do not prefer the term transgender to refer to our gender identity. Only for political reasons or as a personal choice to describe my transitional journey do I use the term trans man or transsexual person. But I am a man, and all my official IDs and records have male in the sex or gender columns. From early childhood itself, I had great troubles aligning with the gender roles assigned to me. Inherently, I always believed, thought, and behaved like any other guy my age. I think when I hit puberty that I felt very embarrassed and very humiliated and hurt due to the changes that were happening to my body. I had to face the harsh reality that these changes wouldn't stop and it wouldn't go away. But when you're 13, I think I didn't really pay any heed to it. I tried to ignore it as much as I could because I thought ignoring it would make it go away. And at that point, I didn't even know what gender identity meant. And during my teenage years, whenever people treated me like a girl or tried to, force gender roles on me, I used to feel frustrated. I used to feel very angry because I knew that they were doing that to me only by default of the body that I was stuck in and how I appeared to them. And that really, I never got acknowledged for how good I was just because I was a girl. And that made me realize how the disparity, between both the genders, and that made me feel very frustrated. And all this frustration became repressed anger, and the repressed anger intensified my dysphoria. And it wasn't until my post-graduation that I really started panicking because I thought at some point, something would change. Like maybe I would fall in love with some guy, and then that would change the way I felt. But none of that ever happened, and I started panicking, and because I didn't think or behave like any other girl my age did. And it wasn't until my early 20s that a friend of mine from abroad introduced me to this television series called The L Word. The L Word was a soap opera, basically. It covered the LGBT lives in US. And there was this trans male character in this series, and the moment I saw him, everything just made sense. But I just couldn't bring myself to come out to my family because my dad had passed away, and I have two elder sisters who were unmarried at that point. And I thought I would bring a lot of shame to the family, and my mom wouldn't be able to take it, and I would spoil the prospect of my sisters getting married, and this put a lot of pressure on me. But I think my depression basically took the better out of me, and I tried committing suicide a lot of times. And in one such suicide attempt, I ended up in the emergency room. And when my mom brought me home, she asked me, "Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to kill yourself?" And I told her, all I could tell her was that I'm not a girl, and I never will be. I just can't do it anymore. And as fortunate as I am, my family always supported me from the beginning. Initially, it was a little difficult because I was under a lot of, I was in a lot of depression, and initially they didn't know how to help me. They didn't know who the right doctors were. They didn't have a lot of awareness on trans identities. But it got better with time. I chose not to transition until my sisters got married and were settled in their lives. I took that time to save money and to fund my own surgeries. And when the time was right, I took the step and I transitioned medically. And it was until last year that I came out to the world through a Facebook post, and I received a lot of positive support and acceptance from friends and relatives. I think I've been one of those few fortunate ones who has received so much of support. I think one of the biggest challenges that I faced was trying to change my gender legally with the Gazette. Now, although there's an ALSA judgment which has been passed by the Supreme Court, so just for the benefit of those who don't know, the NALSA judgment was passed by the Supreme Court in April 2014, and the NALSA judgment basically recognizes a transgender person's right to identify as a gender in line with their self-identification, and you don't need to necessarily go through hormone treatment or surgeries for this. Now, I realized that the government officials in Kerala were completely unaware of the NALSA judgment, and even though I tried to inform them, educate them about it, they just didn't care. They didn't want to know about it, and they just kept harassing people like me to get a medical board certificate from the government to prove my gender. So basically it means stripping in front of doctors, stripping in front of other officials to prove my gender, because as per people in India, your genitals equal to your gender. People don't realize the difference between sex and gender. So it was a 6-month-long battle with the Gazette, and that's how this impacted me was that once it got done, once I got my Gazette, I said to myself, enough is enough, and I don't want any other person to go through this same harassing process. And that's how I got into advocacy, and in a bid to raise awareness about what government officials are doing wrong in Kerala. So I think another challenge that I'm facing is that although I can go back to Dubai and rejoin work, but since a lot of you know that the UAE or the Middle East is anti-LGBT, I risk the chance of someone reporting me as a trans person, and immediately they can arrest and deport me. So currently I've been looking for a job in India since the last year, and it's become difficult for me because there are very few LGBT friendly companies or companies that have LGBT policies. So a big advice or a thought that I would want to share with companies who are listening today is that it's great that you have D&I teams and that you want to be inclusive of trans identities or of LGBT people, but I would tell you to first create policies that have strict harassment or bullying or discrimination clauses. Make sure that you have an environment which is inclusive first, and then only start hiring. And I would also tell that your D&I teams should have a trans person in your, in order for it to succeed. Because as much as you have people who are allies or who mean well, their knowledge on trans experiences would be limited. So what would work best for your D&I teams is for you to hire a trans person. There are a lot of people who are well educated, who have the right qualifications and the experience. So hire a trans person in your D&I team, and it will work work wonders. So I wish you all the best, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Vihan, for sharing your story. This honest sharing by these two wonderful people gives us some powerful insights into the experiences of the transgender community in India, and we hope that it has challenged some of your preconceptions and biases. For the second part of the session, we're delighted to be joined by an expert on transgender inclusion, Deepta Rao. Deepta Rao is an advocate at the Alternative Law Forum, Bangalore. Deepta's main areas of work include free speech and media law, gender and sexuality, and personal law. Deepta represents survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. Deepta is also a part of the core team of Mental Manadil, a peer support group and safe space for conversations on mental health. Deepta has worked extensively with gender and sexual minority communities in crisis interventions and workshops on the legal framework and rights of gender and sexual minorities. We have invited Deepta to join the session today to help share insights and advice on how companies in India can approach this topic and promote transgender inclusion in the workplace. For all of us attending this session, I encourage you to leverage the technology and use the live chat box to ask any questions you might have. We'll pose your questions to Deepta towards the end of the session. Welcome, Deepta. Thank you for being part of this important discussion.
Hi, Sandeep. Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone.
Deepta, I'd like to start by asking how representative are the stories we have just heard of the transgender community in India?
Both the stories and the complexities of their struggles are fairly representative of almost all the trans communities across the board in India. The only thing I'd like to point out at this stage itself is that we're very lucky to have heard two such stories, but there are so many other stories that we probably would never get a chance to hear, and that each story is unique to that person's experience and life struggles. So at the very outset, again, thank Vinita and Vahan for sharing their stories with us. I'd just like to pull out a couple of common threads that we would usually see in any trans person's narrative, especially the struggles with identifying and coming out yourself, your struggles with the state as an entity in enforcing and really recognizing your own identity. And of course, recognizing the fact that the family itself is very often a site of violence. There are success stories, as we heard, but it's really difficult for us at a policy level or a legal framework level to address these issues if we don't understand each of the sites of violence or each of the sites of struggles for trans persons. I was very happy to hear in both the narratives as well that we we see that medicalization isn't a necessity for asserting your gender identity, even though the government insists on the same. So there are a lot of misconceptions that need to be done away with. I'm also very glad to hear from the community members themselves that sensitization programs must be the need of the hour for any company before we start talking about inclusive policies even. So I'm looking forward to hearing that in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Deepta. So, what is being done in India to promote transgender rights, particularly by the government? Can you talk a little bit about the transgender bill?
So, as Vihan pointed out very correctly, our conversations on the legal recognition of trans rights started off with the National Legal Services Authority of India's judgment in 2014, which very categorically laid down that any individual has the right to identify their own gender identity. As per the law, it is seen as your right to identify as either male, female, or transgender. And as we heard from Vinita's testimony, transgender, the term itself could be just an indicative or explanatory usage. It need not necessarily be someone's core identity. So it's really up to anybody to identify in any way they want. And the law, as per the decision of the Supreme Court, recognizes that. Now, the discrepancies enter the picture when we talk about the Right to Trans Persons Bill. The first iteration of the bill was passed in 2014 itself. It was introduced by Tiruchi Shiva. It was withdrawn, modified, and it came out again in 2016, and that's the bill that's mostly going to come up in the winter session this year. There are a couple of issues with this bill. At the very beginning, its definition of trans persons is slightly problematic. And this is something that we ought to be careful of because it defines a trans person as somebody who is not male, not female, not entirely male, not entirely female. And this is the kind of language you definitely want to avoid, especially in a legislation. It is rather condescending to see a piece of law itself starting off in such a negative tone. The other problem with the trans persons bill, even though it talks about the right to self-identify, it requires you to go through a process of gender identification, which means that there will be a cell or a board consisting of a medical officer, a government official, one member of the community, who will go through this process of certifying your self-declared identity. And this, at the very outset, looks like a direct contradiction with the law on self-identification, where I don't need to go to a medical officer to certify the fact that I identify as whoever I want to, or whatever gender I align with. There are several administrative complications as well with the Rights of Trans Persons bill. We can go into that in greater detail, but at the very outset, it looks like this bill, even though it talks about rights in an enabling atmosphere, does not very clearly understand the diversity that exists within the trans community. And also doesn't clearly understand the sites of violence. Another major loophole with this law is that it has no categoric grievance redressal mechanisms. It criminalizes, we don't know whether it really criminalizes or not, it prohibits discrimination, but it doesn't tell us what our redressal mechanisms are. And these are the sort of loopholes that companies ought to be picking up on in their internal policies. These are the sort of loopholes you want to cover. You also have several state policies which don't fall within the realm of the law itself. For instance, Karnataka recently adopted its state policy on transgender rights. You also have Kerala, Odisha, which have state policies. There are some states that have transgender welfare boards. These are positive steps in the right direction, which send out the right message of inclusivity. However, again, it's extremely important to know that at any stage, if we're talking about inclusivity, members of the community need to be there in those conversations from the very beginning itself. Because you can't make up a law for a community. That top-down approach really doesn't work. We're missing out on a lot of perspectives if we do that.
Thank you, Vita. So while we were talking, we just received a question from Karen. So like Vihan mentioned, will hiring a transgender employee create a bigger impact in promoting transgender inclusion? What are your thoughts?
Hiring would definitely help, but at the same time, you're not just talking about ticking off numbers on diversity in your employment status, but also looking at the will of the company to make this an enabling environment. So even though having diverse employees is a very good thing, making sure that those employees have very good grievance redressal mechanisms, are given the same opportunities as all our other employees. There's a very active anti-discrimination policy. Your sexual harassment at workplace policy is made gender neutral in terms of the victim of sexual harassment. These are the sort of steps that you need to take the moment you hire inclusively to make sure that you remain an inclusive company.
Okay, on talking about inclusive companies, we've got one more question that is, will the experience Vinita mentioned about being ignored by her male colleagues be considered as discrimination? Can this be included in the company's discrimination policy?
It certainly can. And again, here comes the issue of the will of the company, really. We do need to understand that what constitutes discrimination is a perceived experience, it is a perceived incident. And this perception will differ from person to person based off their experiences and their narratives. So for us to truly be an acceptable and safe working space, It is important to have a diverse set of people who are drafting these policies on discrimination so that you don't miss out anybody's experiences and perspectives when you're actually legislating on behalf of the company.
Great. Sadipta, we have a question from, I think, from somebody. I mean, the name is not clear. So, how do you talk to a trans person to learn more and educate yourself, but without offending them? What should you ask? What shouldn't you ask?
So there's really no guidebook on how you speak to people. It's really how you interact with each other as human beings, and that's where we start off. We're all human beings, and we're all the same. However, there are certain heteronormative, patriarchal practices that we're all trapped in. Um, One of the most important things to understand is that yes, a person has the right to self-identify, but that puts a duty on those around that person to be sensitive of that matter. So it's important not to misgender someone based on what you perceive their gender to be. It's always good to ask and clarify. The use of pronouns as well is something that is entirely up to an individual to choose. For instance, I would prefer being identified as a female, as a woman. So you may use feminine pronouns when you speak to me or about me. It's always good to clarify this with somebody before you start off that conversation. These are just basic ground rules that ought to become habits and ought to become part of our workplace vocabulary. Um, but again, your interactions will also depend on the manner in which the workplace itself has been sensitized. And I cannot stress enough on this need.
Thank you. And next is what are your advice to LGBT attendees watching this session?
Thank you so much for being here, and I'm glad that you're here. I do hope that at some point in the future, you don't feel the need for a legal expert to be here, but this entire panel could be run by members of the community, because ownership of the community in spaces at your workplace is extremely important.
So we'll take the last question. How optimistic are you about the future for transgender inclusion and why?
If you look at the legislative track right now in India, I'm not very optimistic simply because our lawmakers don't seem to be as aware of ground realities when it comes to trans community members. But I am certainly optimistic because the community has come together in a very, very resounding way. Um, this is again something that I would advise companies to take rather seriously in making sure that community members are consulted, are involved in the process of making of policies, are definitely a part of all benefits that other employees would otherwise be entitled to. In terms of advocacy, definitely there is much more voice for the community. The community is a lot more visible. But at the same time, we need to understand that the community is not homogeneous. So to keep all of these things in mind, advocacy-wise, we're going good. Law and policy, we still have a long way to go, I would say.
Right. So one more last question. So what is the support provided by government for access to education and health?
Now, if you look at the Right to Education Act, which is now on the basis of a fundamental right to access education, um, you do not have any specific safeguards for transgender persons. However, once NALSA came in, it was laid down that trans persons must be given access to education through your existing affirmative action framework, which would be through the framework of reservations. However, one thing that policy has failed quite consistently to recognize and understand is that at the entry level, ensuring inclusivity does not mean that inclusivity remains throughout your process of education. So once you secure entry level representation or inclusivity, it becomes the job of an educational institution to ensure that a person remains in education and passes out of that educational institution with qualification. Now, that's one of the main problems within the community because as both Vihan and Vinita said, you tend to begin asserting your gender identity at a particular age, right, from school. So in terms of education, we are seeing some positive signs through the Trans Persons Bill of 2016. However, it hasn't been very clearly articulated. It requires a lot more threshing out, a lot more pressure on the schools, on the government itself to ensure exactly the methods in which we're going to keep trans persons in the schools, retain trans persons in schools.
Okay, one more last question. I'm so sorry. So after SRS, is the certificate from hospital a must?
Now, this is a challenge that we're seeing very consistently. If you look at NALSA and if you look at the law that has been tabled as a bill at the moment, you do not require a medical certificate for your transition. An affidavit is more than enough. You swear to your new name, your new gender identity in that affidavit. You notarize it and you get it published either in two newspapers, one English and one in the local language, or in, as in Vihan's case, in the Gazette. You do not require a medical certificate that certifies your new gender identity. However, the lack of awareness within government departments means that they will start demanding medical certificates. They will start demanding say, a psychiatrist's evaluation, which is again something that the NALSA judgment categorically says should not be happening. So you have two things here. One is the demand of the community to follow the easiest method of gender identification. And the second is a lot of need for sensitization within the government and companies themselves. So what we see at the government level could very well be replicated within a company's structure, wherein during transition in a company, for instance, if a company is not going to be helping me change my records, is not going to help me access entitlements as an employee, simply because I have transitioned, you have a problem there.
Thank you so much, Deepta, especially for answering so many questions. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. As this session comes to a close, I would like to thank, on behalf of Community Business and our sponsor Google, all our speakers, Vinita, Vihan, and Deepta. I think we have all learned a lot, and we thank you for taking the time to share your stories and insights with us. Community is committed to championing this issue and working to support companies. As mentioned at the beginning of the session, today we are launching the latest addition to our Dian India Insight series on the topic, promoting transgender inclusion in India, what role companies can play. Please do reach out to us for a copy of this publication. For those of you who have further questions about LGBT inclusion in India, we encourage you to log on to our Ask the Expert live chat session at 4 p.m. with featured expert Shubha Chako. Shubha Chako is director of two pioneering NGOs in India, Solidarity Foundation, a young India-based foundation set up to provide support to sex workers and sexual minorities, and Aneka, which aims to foster social justice and to enhance, promote, and protect rights of marginalized communities, especially sexual minorities, sex workers, women, and people living with HIV. In her Ask the Expert session, Shubha can provide advice on how to approach the topic of LGBT inclusion in the workplace in India, particularly bearing in mind the current legal context and local sensitivities. So with that, it just remains for me to thank you for attending this session and highlight that the recorded session will be available for download for 30 days. So you found this useful. If you found this useful, we encourage you to share it with your network. Thank you and goodbye.